A black woman, quietly working as the wedding DJ, is treated like she doesn't belong. The bride humiliates her in front of the crowd, mocking her music and calling it junk. What no one knows, this DJ is a world-famous artist who's won a Grammy. When the truth comes out, the room will go silent, jaws will drop, and the bride will regret every word. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story is already hitting home, make sure you smash that like button. It really helps us keep bringing you powerful stories like this one. The grand ballroom was a sea of white roses and glittering chandeliers. Laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air, a perfect symphony for a perfect wedding. At the head of the room, on a small, elevated stage, Danielle Carter stood behind her DJ booth. The equipment wasn't her usual state-of-the-art studio setup, but it was professional, clean, and more than enough for the job. She wore simple black trousers and a black silk shirt, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her goal was to blend in, to be the invisible force that kept the energy high and the dance floor full. The music she played was a smooth blend of classic soul and modern R&B, a carefully curated list designed to please a wide range of ages. Guests were dancing, their faces flushed with joy. A group of older relatives were swaying gently by the cake table, while younger cousins were showing off their moves in the center of the floor. Everything was going according to plan. Danielle saw the bride, Victoria Sanders, making her way toward the stage. She moved like a ship in full sail, her white dress a cloud of expensive fabric around her. Her face, however, was not one of a happy newlywed. It was a mask of thunderous disapproval. Her perfectly painted lips were pulled into a tight line, and her eyes were narrowed into slits. Danielle felt a familiar prickle of unease. She had seen that look before on the faces of producers who thought they knew better, on executives who dismissed her ideas before she even spoke. She kept her hands on the mixer, her expression neutral, waiting. Victoria didn't stop at the edge of the stage. She marched right up the steps, her heels clicking angrily on the polished wood. She didn't speak to Danielle. She didn't even look at her. Instead, she reached for the microphone resting on its stand. Her movements were jerky, filled with a sense of entitlement that sucked the air out of the room. The music was still playing, a classic soul track that had just coaxed Ethan's grandmother onto the floor. But the energy was shifting. People were starting to notice the bride's rigid posture, the fury in her eyes. The dancing slowed. A few people stopped altogether, turning to watch. Victoria grabbed the microphone and lifted it to her lips. Her voice, amplified by the speakers, cut through the music like a shard of glass. "Can we stop this? Awful noise?" she shouted. The music abruptly cut off as Danielle, startled by the sudden aggression, hit the master stop. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room was now fixed on the stage. The joyous atmosphere of moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. "Seriously," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with disdain as she scanned the crowd. "I asked for celebration music. Real music. Not this. Junk." She gestured vaguely at Danielle's equipment, a look of disgust on her face. A few of Victoria's friends, a tight-knit group of bridesmaids, let out a few nervous, tittering laughs. Most of the guests, however, looked shocked. Their smiles had frozen on their faces. They exchanged confused, uneasy glances. Danielle stood perfectly still. Her hands rested lightly on the turntables, her posture relaxed. Inside, her heart was beating a steady, controlled rhythm. This was not the first time she had been publicly belittled. It was, however, the most unexpected. She had come here as a friend, as a gift. She had intentionally dressed down, used simpler equipment, all to keep the focus on the bride and groom. She had wanted to be a footnote in their beautiful day, but Victoria was determined to make her the main event. The groom, Ethan, stood near the head table, his face a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. He started to move toward the stage, a hesitant step forward, but then stopped. He looked at his new wife, then at the silent crowd, and seemed paralyzed by indecision. He knew Danielle. He knew exactly who she was. But his loyalty in this first hour of his marriage was being tested in a way he had never imagined. Victoria, emboldened by the spotlight, turned her attention directly to Danielle. She didn't lower the microphone. She wanted everyone to hear. "I have no idea who hired you," she said, her voice laced with venom. "But I can assure you, no serious bride, no one with any taste would ever choose someone like you for their wedding." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. A collective gasp went through the room. Ethan's mother put a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Danielle finally looked up, her gaze meeting Victoria's. Her eyes were calm, clear, and unreadable. She didn't flinch, she didn't argue. She simply absorbed the insult, a silent witness to the bride's spectacular self-destruction. She lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but as if to give Victoria the space to finish, to completely and utterly humiliate herself. The blow had been delivered, a public slap in the face, and Danielle, with a strength no one in that room could possibly comprehend, took it without a word. The humiliation was a thick blanket smothering the joy of the wedding, and it had been laid squarely at Danielle's feet. But Danielle knew something Victoria didn't. The weight wasn't hers to carry. It belonged entirely to the woman holding the microphone. The silence in the ballroom stretched on, becoming more and more uncomfortable. Victoria seemed to thrive on it, mistaking the stunned quiet for agreement. She waved a dismissive hand in Danielle's direction, as if shooing away an insect. "You're just a DJ," she said, her voice loud and condescending. She turned to her bridesmaids, who were huddled near the stage, their expressions a mix of sycophantic support and genuine shock. "Honestly, she's probably some cleaning lady who saw some equipment and decided to try and play music." The insult was so specific, so deeply laced with classism and prejudice, that it made the air crackle. Several guests audibly gasped this time. An older man, one of Ethan's uncles, shook his head slowly, his face etched with disapproval. Danielle's calm facade remained unbroken. Her expression didn't change, but inside, a cold, hard knot was forming in her stomach. "Cleaning lady." The words echoed in her mind. She thought of her mother, who had cleaned houses to pay for Danielle's first piano lessons. She thought of the countless hours she had spent cleaning her own studio, sweeping floors and wiping down consoles after grueling 20-hour sessions, all in pursuit of the perfect sound. The insult was meant to diminish her, to put her in a box labeled unimportant. But for Danielle, it was a reminder of the hard work that had forged her. Victoria's ignorance was a weapon, but Danielle was protected by an armor of truth that the bride couldn't even see. Victoria's anger grew in the face of Danielle's composure. She wanted a reaction. She wanted tears, or yelling, or a flustered apology. The silent dignity was infuriating to her. It was like screaming at a mountain. "Are you even going to say anything?" Victoria snapped, stepping closer to the DJ booth. "Or are you just going to stand there?" She reached out, her fingers aiming for the power switch on the main console. Her intention was clear: to silence the entire setup, to physically erase Danielle's presence. Before her fingers could make contact, Danielle moved. Her motion was not aggressive or sudden. It was fluid, deliberate, and impossibly fast. She placed her hand over Victoria's, gently but firmly, stopping its descent. Her touch was light, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority. "Please don't touch the equipment," Danielle said. Her voice was low and even, devoid of any anger. It was not a plea, but a quiet command. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Victoria's face. She tried to pull her hand away, but Danielle's grip, though gentle, was unyielding. Across the room, Ethan was finally spurred into action. The sight of his wife physically trying to shut down the music, of her hand being stopped by the very woman he respected so deeply, broke his paralysis. He started walking toward the stage, his face now a storm cloud of conflict and shame. This was his wife. This was the woman he had just pledged his life to, and she was revealing a side of herself that was ugly and cruel in front of every single person they cared about. He knew he had to intervene, but he didn't know how to undo the damage that had already been done. Watching from the side of the room, clutching a tray of empty glasses, was a waitress named Maya Lopez. Her dark eyes were wide with a mixture of disgust and outrage. She had seen entitled clients before. She had been on the receiving end of condescending remarks and dismissive gestures. But this was different. This was a public execution of someone's dignity. She watched Danielle's quiet strength, the way she protected her space without resorting to aggression, and she felt a surge of admiration. She looked at the bride with her expensive dress and her ugly heart, and felt nothing but contempt. The tray in her hands felt heavy, a symbol of her station, the same station Victoria had just used as an insult. In that moment, Maya felt a connection to the woman on the stage. She didn't know who Danielle was, but she knew that what was happening was wrong. The tension in the room was a tightly wound spring, and everyone could feel that it was about to snap. Victoria, the bride who thought she was the queen of the evening, was standing on a precipice, completely unaware that the woman she was tormenting held the power to push her over the edge. The narrator's voice slips into the scene, pulling the audience back in time, away from the tense ballroom and into a world of gleaming glass, polished platinum, and the hushed reverence of a world-class recording studio. This wasn't just any studio. This was the Sanctuary, Danielle Carter's personal creative haven, a place where musical legends were made. The walls were lined not with wedding photos, but with platinum records, each one a testament to a hit she had produced, a career she had launched, a sound she had perfected. The camera of the mind pans across a shelf, cluttered not with cheap trinkets but with prestigious awards. And there in the center, gleaming under a single spotlight, was the industry's highest honor, a small golden gramophone, a Grammy. Awarded to Danielle Carter for Producer of the Year for an album that had not only gone multi-platinum but had redefined a genre. The audience sees flashes of another Danielle. This one is not in simple black clothes blending into the background. This Danielle is on stage, accepting that Grammy, her voice clear and strong as she thanks her team. This Danielle is in the studio, her fingers flying across a massive mixing board, her eyes closed in concentration as she coaxes a perfect harmony from a nervous young singer. This Danielle is laughing with some of the biggest names in music, artists who considered it an honor to work with her, who called her a genius, a visionary. She was not just a DJ. She was a titan of the industry, a self-made millionaire, a quiet powerhouse whose influence was felt every time you turned on the radio. So, why was she here at this wedding, enduring the insults of an arrogant bride? The answer was simple, and it was the very thing Victoria could never understand: loyalty. Ethan Sanders, the groom, was more than just a client or an acquaintance. He was a friend, and a friend she owed a debt of gratitude. Years ago, he had been a young tech entrepreneur who had invested in her first studio when no one else would. He had believed in her talent before the awards and the platinum records. He saw the fire in her when others just saw a young black woman with an impossible dream. When he had asked her to be a part of his wedding, she had been touched. He had offered to pay her an exorbitant fee to fly in her entire professional setup. But Danielle had refused. "No, Ethan," she had told him over the phone, her voice warm. "This one's a gift. Let me just come and play some music. No big production. I don't want to steal the spotlight. The day is about you and Victoria." She wanted to be there simply as Danielle, his friend. She wanted to blend in, to give him a gift from the heart, not a performance from a celebrity. She chose humility. She chose to put friendship above fame. And now, standing on that stage, her kindness was being twisted, her humility mistaken for weakness. The secret she had tried so hard to keep, the identity she had hidden to honor her friend, was now the source of her humiliation. The audience was now in on the secret. They understood the immense gap between who Victoria thought Danielle was and who she truly was. And with that knowledge, the tension in the ballroom becomes almost unbearable. The storm was no longer just brewing. It was here. And only one person in that room was truly in its eye. The story of Danielle and Ethan went deeper than just a business investment. The narrator takes us back further, to a darker time in Ethan's life. He was in his late 20s. His first tech startup had just crashed and burned, and he had fallen into a deep, debilitating depression. He was lost, adrift in a sea of failure and self-doubt. He shut himself away from the world, convinced he was worthless. His family worried. His friends didn't know how to reach him. It was Danielle who had broken through. She hadn't known him well back then. They were just acquaintances in the same professional circles. But she had heard about his struggles through a mutual friend. One day she showed up at his apartment unannounced. He remembered opening the door, expecting a food delivery, and seeing her standing there. She wasn't carrying flowers or a self-help book. She just looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "I hear you're going through something. Come with me." She didn't take him to a doctor or a therapist. She took him to her studio. It was smaller back then, a cramped space in a rundown building, but to Ethan it felt like a cathedral. It was filled with a creative energy that was palpable. She didn't talk about his failed company or his feelings. Instead, she sat him down in front of a synthesizer and a computer. "I need a beat for a new track," she said simply. "I'm stuck. See what you can do." At first he resisted. He hadn't touched an instrument in years. He felt clumsy and useless. But Danielle was patient. She showed him the basics, left him alone with the sounds, and let the music do the work. For hours, he lost himself in creating rhythms, in arranging melodies. It was the first time in months he hadn't been trapped in his own head. He started going to the studio every day. It became his sanctuary, his therapy. Danielle never charged him a penny. She would just leave a pot of coffee brewing and let him work. She saw the spark of creativity in him, the same spark that had driven her, and she nurtured it. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to heal. Producing music gave him a sense of purpose, a way to channel his pain into something beautiful. It was in that small, cluttered studio that Ethan found his confidence again. He eventually went on to build a new, wildly successful tech company, becoming the wealthy CEO he was today. But he never forgot what Danielle did for him. She hadn't just given him a hobby. She had, in a very real way, saved his life. So when he got engaged, Danielle was one of the first people he called. He wanted her there not as a celebrity guest to show off, but as family. He wanted her to be a central part of the celebration that he felt he owed, in part, to her. When she offered to DJ, he was overwhelmed with gratitude. It was the most personal, most meaningful gift she could have given. It was a full-circle moment. The woman who had helped him find his rhythm was now providing the rhythm for the most important day of his life. And this was the woman his new wife had just called a cleaning lady. The weight of this history pressed down on Ethan as he stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. The humiliation Victoria was heaping on Danielle wasn't just an insult to a wedding vendor. It was a desecration of a sacred friendship, a deep and personal betrayal of the very foundation upon which his new life was built. Maya Lopez watched the bride's tirade from her post by the banquet hall doors. Every cruel word felt like a physical blow. Her blood was boiling, a hot, angry current rushing through her veins. She had served people like Victoria her whole life, people who looked right through her, who treated service staff as if they were invisible furniture. But this was worse. This wasn't just dismissiveness. It was a deliberate public act of cruelty designed to strip someone of their dignity. She looked at Danielle, standing so still and quiet on the stage, and saw not weakness, but a kind of powerful restraint that she couldn't comprehend. During a brief, tense lull, after Victoria had stormed off the stage to soak in the smug satisfaction with her bridesmaids, Maya saw her chance. Danielle had stepped down from the platform, ostensibly to check a connection on a speaker. But Maya knew she was just trying to get out of the spotlight. Maya moved quickly, her server's uniform allowing her to navigate the crowded room without drawing attention. She approached Danielle, keeping her voice low. "Ma'am," she began, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed anger. "You can't let her do that to you. You can't let her get away with that." Danielle looked up, And for the first time, Maya saw a flicker of something behind the calm facade. It wasn't anger or sadness, it was weariness. "It's okay," Danielle said softly, her voice a low murmur. "It's not worth it." "Not worth it?" Maya's voice rose a little and she quickly lowered it again. "She called you a cleaning lady in front of 200 people. She humiliated you. That's not okay." Maya's sense of justice was screaming. She couldn't stand by and watch this happen. "People need to know who you are. You should tell them." Danielle gave a small, sad shake of her head. A part of her was tempted. The artist in her, the proud creator, wanted to scream her accomplishments from the stage. But the friend in her, the one who had come here to celebrate Ethan, held her back. Revealing herself now would turn the entire wedding into a circus. It would humiliate Ethan and make the whole day about her. It was a price she wasn't willing to pay, not yet. "Not yet," she whispered, more to herself than to Maya. "Let's just see how this plays out." Maya stared at her, frustrated but also deeply impressed. This woman had a strength she had never encountered before. But Maya wasn't willing to leave it to chance. She had seen how these things played out. The powerful always won, and the quiet were always forgotten. As she walked away, a new resolve hardened within her. If Danielle wouldn't fight for herself, Maya would fight for her. She slipped her phone out of her apron pocket. It was an old model, the screen slightly cracked, but the camera worked. She found a discreet position behind a large floral arrangement with a clear view of Victoria and her giggling friends. She pressed the record button. The red light blinked, a tiny beacon of rebellion in the opulent room. She didn't know what she would do with the video, but she knew she needed proof. She would not let Victoria's cruelty be forgotten or dismissed as a simple misunderstanding. She was a waitress, a person Victoria would never notice, and she was about to become the most important witness in the room. The seed of an alliance had been planted, not in a grand gesture, but in the quiet, determined act of a woman who refused to be a bystander to injustice. Victoria, flush with a sense of victory, held court near the towering seven-tiered wedding cake. She was a queen surrounded by her fawning ladies-in-waiting, her bridesmaids. The confrontation had energized her, filling her with a heady rush of power. She replayed the scene over and over for them, each telling more dramatic than the last, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "You should have seen her face," she exclaimed, laughing a high, brittle laugh. "She didn't know what to hit her. I really put that DJ in her place." One of her bridesmaids, a woman named Jessica with a perpetually nervous smile, nodded enthusiastically. "You were amazing, Vicky." Someone had to say something. The music was so dreary. Another bridesmaid chimed in. "Totally. My cousin had a DJ at her wedding who was a real professional. He had lights, a smoke machine, all this." She gestured vaguely at Danielle's clean, minimalist setup. Victoria seized on the comment. "Exactly. Look at her cheap equipment. It looks like she bought it at a garage sale." She sneered in the direction of the stage, where Danielle was now quietly checking cables, her back to the room. "Ethan has all this money, and this is the best he could do? He should have hired a real entertainer, someone with some class." The guests nearby could hear every word. Their reactions were a tapestry of discomfort. Some, who knew Ethan well, exchanged worried looks. They knew this wasn't like him. He was a kind, down-to-earth person, and this display of public cruelty from his new wife was jarring. A few older guests, friends of Ethan's parents, whispered amongst themselves, their faces tight with disapproval. "Such an ugly display," one woman murmured to her husband. "That poor girl just doing her job." Others, however, remained silent. They were clients of Ethan's, or colleagues, and they didn't want to get involved. They sipped their champagne, studied the floral centerpieces, and pretended not to hear the bride tearing another person down. Victoria was completely oblivious to the shifting mood in the room. She was so wrapped up in her own performance, so convinced of her own superiority that she couldn't read the signs of her social demise. To her, the whispers were of admiration. The silence was of awe. She believed she had saved her own wedding from a terrible mistake, that she had asserted her authority as the bride and set the proper tone. She was basking in the glow of her perceived triumph, completely unaware that she had just publicly insulted a Grammy-winning music producer, a woman whose cheap equipment was likely worth more than Victoria's wedding dress. Her arrogance was a blindfold, and it was leading her straight towards a cliff she couldn't see. Each boastful word, each cruel laugh, was just another shovelful of dirt on the grave she was digging for her own reputation. Ethan stood by the bar, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. He felt a cold dread spreading through his chest, a feeling completely at odds with the joy he was supposed to be feeling on his wedding day. He watched Victoria holding court with her friends, saw her smug smile and animated gestures, and felt a profound sense of disconnect. Who was this person? This was not the woman he had fallen in love with, or more accurately, this was a side of her he had deliberately ignored. He had seen glimpses of it before. A sharp comment to a waiter, a dismissive attitude towards a store clerk, a flash of jealousy when his work took precedence. He had always written it off as stress, or a bad day, or the pressure of wedding planning. But now, seeing it on full display, magnified and undeniable in front of everyone he knew, he could no longer make excuses. His mind was racing, replaying the scene at the DJ booth. He knew Danielle's true identity. He knew the depth of her talent, the respect she commanded in her world. More than that, he knew her heart. He knew the quiet, unassuming kindness she had shown him when he was at his lowest. He had asked her to be here, to share her gift, and in return, his wife had treated her like garbage. The shame was a physical weight on his shoulders. He had betrayed Danielle's trust by allowing this to happen. By standing by and doing nothing, he had been complicit in her humiliation. He glanced around the room and saw what Victoria, in her bubble of arrogance, could not. He saw the looks on his family's faces, disappointment, shock, and pity. He saw his business partners shifting uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. The whispers weren't about bad music, they were about his wife's appalling behavior. "Did you hear what she called her?" someone murmured, not quietly enough. "Unbelievable," another replied. His perfect wedding had become a spectacle of his own bad judgment. He was the wealthy tech CEO who had apparently married a cruel, petty tyrant. The conflict inside him was a raging storm. Part of him, the newly married husband, wanted to smooth things over, to defend his wife, to pretend this was all a misunderstanding. But the other part, the part that remembered Danielle's unwavering friendship, the part that valued decency and respect, knew that this could not be ignored. This wasn't just an embarrassing moment. It was a revelation of character. The woman he had just vowed to spend his life with had shown him her true colors, and they were ugly. As he watched her laugh, completely unaware of the damage she had caused, a quiet resolve began to form within him. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Victoria's actions would not go unanswered. The wedding might continue for a few more hours, but for Ethan, the marriage already felt like it was over. The noise of the reception, the forced laughter, and the low hum of awkward conversation began to feel suffocating to Danielle. She needed air. She needed a moment of stillness to recalibrate. Excusing herself with a quiet word to her young assistant, who was watching everything with wide, worried eyes, she slipped out a side door onto a secluded stone patio. The cool night air was a welcome relief, a clean slate against the tainted atmosphere inside. The distant sounds of the city provided a comforting, impersonal hum. She leaned against the cool stone balustrade, looking out over the manicured gardens of the venue. She was not crying. Her hands were not shaking. The anger she felt was not a hot, explosive rage, but a cold, clear, and focused energy. Victoria hadn't just insulted her. She had insulted her work, her history, and the memory of her mother. She had mistaken Danielle's choice to be humble for an invitation to be humiliated, and that was a line that could not be uncrossed. Danielle reached into the pocket of her trousers and pulled out her phone. It was a sleek, modern device, a tool of her trade. Her thumb moved purposefully across the screen, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Marcus Vance, PR/legal. She pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear. It rang only once before a calm, professional voice answered. Danielle? I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight. Is everything all right? Everything is fine, Marcus, Danielle said, her own voice a mirror of his, steady, controlled, and all business. But something has come up. I need you and the team to be ready. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Marcus knew Danielle well. She never called with drama. She was the most low-profile, high-impact client he had. If she was calling on a Saturday night from a wedding she was attending as a friend, it was serious. Ready for what? He asked, his tone shifting, becoming more alert. Remember that press release we drafted last year? The one about the new philanthropic arm of the company? The one focused on supporting women in the arts? Danielle asked, her eyes scanning the dark garden. Of course, Marcus replied. The Lift As You Climb initiative. It's ready to go. We were waiting for the right time to launch. The right time might be tonight, Danielle said. I want you to add a new detail to it, a significant multi-year partnership and funding grant. I'll send you the name of the organization later. I want you to have the revised draft ready to send out to every major news outlet within the hour, if I give you the signal. Marcus was silent for a moment, processing. This was a major move being planned and executed on the fly. Danielle, what's going on? He asked gently. I'm at a wedding, she said simply, and someone just made a very public, very foolish mistake. They tried to make me feel small. Instead, I'm going to use the attention to do something big. Her voice was devoid of malice. It was the voice of a CEO making a strategic decision, a producer seeing the entire composition of the song, not just one sour note. This wasn't about revenge. It was about power. Not the petty power of a bride yelling into a microphone, but the real power to create, to build, and to change the narrative. She was a woman who knew her worth, and she was about to remind everyone else. The storm was no longer just coming. It was about to break, and it would be a storm of her own making. Back inside, the atmosphere had grown strained. The dance floor was mostly empty. Guests lingered in small, quiet groups, speaking in hushed tones. The wedding, which had started with so much promise, was now sinking under the weight of Victoria's public outburst. The wedding planner, a harried-looking woman with a clipboard pressed to her chest, scurried over to Ethan. We need to move things along, she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. The cake cutting, the bouquet toss. We need to get the energy back up. Ethan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw Maya, the waitress, standing near the kitchens. She caught his eye and gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. It told him that he wasn't alone in his disgust, that an ally was waiting in the wings. An idea began to form in his mind, a risky, audacious plan to salvage not the wedding, but some small measure of justice for Danielle. He walked over to the wedding planner. Change of plans, he said, his voice firm. We're going to have a special guest performance now. A surprise for my bride. The planner looked confused, but the groom's word was law. A performance? But who? Just make the announcement, Ethan interrupted, a new and steely authority in his voice. He then walked over to the DJ booth, where Danielle's young assistant was nervously trying to fill the silence with quiet, inoffensive background music. Ethan leaned in and spoke to him in a low voice, giving him a set of instructions and handing him a small USB drive from his pocket. The assistant's eyes widened in understanding, and he nodded, quickly getting to work. A few minutes later, the wedding planner stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone gingerly. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, her voice trembling slightly. May I have your attention, please? The groom has arranged a very special surprise. a special guest performance to honor his new bride, Victoria. A ripple of anticipation went through the crowd. This, they thought, might be the thing that saved the night. Victoria, who had been sulking near the cake, immediately perked up. A surprise? For her? Of course. This must have been Ethan's plan all along. He had hired a famous singer or a band to make up for the terrible DJ. Her mood instantly lifted. The smug, self-satisfied smile returned to her face. She smoothed the front of her expensive dress, adjusted the veil in her hair, and preened for the crowd. She was the star of the show again. This was how it was supposed to be. She glided to the edge of the dance floor, positioning herself in the center of everyone's attention, ready to receive her tribute. Guests gathered around, their phones out, ready to capture the moment. Danielle was nowhere to be seen, having slipped back into the room and taken a position in the shadows at the very back, a silent observer. Maya, from her vantage point near the kitchens, gave Ethan another small, encouraging nod. She knew something was about to happen. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and the trap was perfectly laid. The humiliation that was about to unfold was not for Danielle. It was for the bride, who stood smiling under the spotlight, completely unaware that she was the guest of honor at her own public execution. The ballroom lights dimmed, casting the room in a soft, expectant glow. The only light was a single bright spotlight on the large projector screen that had, until now, been displaying a looping slideshow of photos of the happy couple. Victoria stood bathed in the light, a beatific smile on her face, ready for her surprise. The screen went black. A low, resonant bass line began to thrum from the speakers, a sound that was rich, complex, and professionally mixed. It was a sound that Danielle's cheap equipment was reproducing with flawless clarity. Then, an image flickered onto the screen. It wasn't a singer or a band. It was a photograph of Danielle Carter, not as she looked tonight, but on the red carpet, dressed in a stunning designer gown, holding a golden trophy, the Grammy. The text below the image was simple and stark. Danielle Carter, Producer of the Year. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Guests squinted at the screen, then looked around the room, searching for the woman they had only known as the DJ. Another image flashed on the screen. This time it was Danielle in a recording studio, laughing with one of the world's biggest pop stars. The pop star had his arm around her, looking at her with an expression of pure admiration. Then another clip, this one a video. It was from a famous music documentary. A legendary rock musician was being interviewed. "Danielle Carter," he said, his voice full of respect. "She's not just a producer. She's a force of nature. She hears things no one else hears. Working with her was the highlight of my career." The evidence began to pile up, an undeniable avalanche of success and prestige. Magazine covers with headlines like "The Midas Touch," "How Danielle Carter Dominates the Charts," snippets from award shows, performance clips with artists from every genre imaginable. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder, turning into gasps of recognition. "Wait a minute," someone whispered loudly. "Is that the DJ?" Another guest pulled out their phone, quickly typing her name into a search engine. His jaw dropped. "Oh my God," he breathed. She's a legend." Victoria's smile had vanished. Her face, a moment ago so full of smug expectation, was now a mask of pale, dawning horror. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the screen, unable to process what she was seeing. The images were a direct contradiction of everything she had said, everything she had believed. The cleaning lady was a celebrated genius. The junk music was the sound that had defined a decade. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of the cognitive dissonance. Then the final piece of the presentation began. The audio from the Grammy Awards ceremony filled the room. And the Grammy for Producer of the Year goes to Danielle Carter. The sound of thunderous applause echoed through the ballroom speakers. At that exact moment, Ethan stepped onto the stage, taking the microphone from the stunned wedding planner. The video on the screen faded, leaving only a single beautiful photo of Danielle smiling and holding her award. The room fell completely silent. Every eye was on Ethan. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze calm and steady. Then he looked directly at his wife. "Everyone," he said, his voice clear and ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from him before. "I'd like you to properly meet my dear friend, the woman who so graciously offered to provide the music tonight as her personal wedding gift to us. This is Danielle Carter, a Grammy-winning producer and one of the most talented and respected people I have ever known." The silence held for a beat, and then the room erupted. It wasn't polite wedding applause. It was a genuine, explosive ovation, a wave of respect and admiration for Danielle, and a deafening condemnation of the woman who had so publicly tried to tear her down. Victoria stood frozen in the spotlight, the applause crashing over her like a physical force. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving it a sickly, chalky white. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked around desperately, searching for support, for an ally, but found none. Her bridesmaids, who had been her loyal chorus just an hour before, now stood several feet away, their faces a mixture of horror and second-hand embarrassment. They wouldn't meet her eyes. They were slowly, deliberately distancing themselves from the social wreckage. I didn't know," she finally managed to stammer, her voice a pathetic whisper that was lost in the continuing applause. It was a weak excuse, and everyone knew it. Her cruelty hadn't been conditional on Danielle's status. It had been pure, unadulterated arrogance, an assumption that anyone she perceived as being beneath her was deserving of contempt. The fact that she had been wrong about Danielle's station in life didn't excuse the malice. It only made her look like a fool. The guests were no longer on her side. The tide of public opinion had turned against her with breathtaking speed. They looked at her not with sympathy, but with a cold, unforgiving judgment. Their whispers were no longer about the DJ, they were about the bride. "Can you imagine being so cruel? She deserves this." What did Ethan ever see in her? As the applause for Danielle began to subside, a new player stepped forward. It was Maya, the waitress. She walked with a purpose she had never felt before, her head held high. She approached Ethan, who was still on the stage, and showed him the phone in her hand. On the screen was the video she had recorded. A clear, damning piece of evidence showing Victoria at her absolute worst, her voice dripping with scorn as she called Danielle a cleaning lady. Ethan watched the short clip, his expression hardening into a mask of pure disgust. He nodded grimly at Maya, a silent thank you. Then he turned back to the crowd, and his voice boomed through the microphone once more. He didn't show the video. He didn't need to. The testimony was written on his face. He looked directly at Victoria, his eyes holding no trace of the love and affection that had been there just hours before. They were cold, like chips of ice. The crowd grew silent again, sensing that the final blow was about to be delivered. Danielle, who had remained in the shadows at the back of the room, watched the scene unfold. She hadn't needed to say a single word. Her accomplishments, her dignity, and now her allies were speaking for her. Her silence was a roar that was louder and more powerful than any insult Victoria could ever have hurled. The bride, who had tried so hard to be the center of attention, had finally succeeded. She was the star of her own downfall, and she was utterly, hopelessly alone. Ethan held the microphone, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. He was no longer the hesitant, conflicted groom. He was a man who had been pushed past his limit, a man whose eyes had been violently forced open. The video on Maya's phone had been the final brutal confirmation. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a bride having a stressful moment. It was a calculated act of cruelty, delivered with a smug sense of superiority. His shame had burned away, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Anger at Victoria for her viciousness, but also anger at himself for his blindness. He looked down from the stage at the woman in the white dress, the woman who was now looking at him with wide, pleading eyes. The pleading came too late. He had seen her true self, and it was a sight he could never unsee. "For weeks," Ethan began, his voice resonating with a pained clarity, "I listened to you talk about this wedding. About the perfect dress, the perfect flowers, the perfect image. It was all about how things looked." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I realize now. I was so focused on the picture you were painting, I forgot to look at the painter." A collective gasp swept through the room. This was no longer just about an insulted DJ. This was about the very foundation of the marriage itself, and it was crumbling in front of a live audience. Victoria took a hesitant step forward, her hand outstretched. "Ethan, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Let's not do this here." "Here is the only place we can do this," he countered, his voice unyielding. "You chose this stage, Victoria. You chose this audience." He looked out at their guests, his friends, his family. "The woman you just tried to destroy is one of the kindest, most decent human beings I have ever known. She helped me when I had nothing. She believed in me. Her presence here tonight was meant to be a blessing on our marriage." He shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "Instead, you used it as an opportunity to show everyone your true character. And for that, I am not just embarrassed. I am humiliated." He took a deep breath, the finality of his next words hanging heavy in the air. "This isn't the woman I thought I married." The words struck Victoria like a physical blow. Her face crumpled, the mask of the perfect bride finally shattering, revealing the terrified, lost person underneath. At the back of the room, Danielle gave a single small nod. Her part in this was over. She turned to leave, her dignity not just intact, but magnified. As she walked toward the exit, the crowd saw her. A few people started to clap, and then a few more, and within seconds, the entire room, with the exception of Victoria and her shell-shocked bridesmaids, was on its feet, giving Danielle a standing ovation. They were clapping for her talent, for her grace under pressure, and for the quiet justice that had just been served. Victoria, seeing her last hope walking out the door, made a final desperate move. She ran towards the stage, trying to get to Ethan. "Ethan, wait!" she cried out, but he simply shook his head, his back to her. He had already turned away. "We're done," he said, not to her, but into the microphone, a public decree. The words echoed through the silent room. Victoria's legs gave out, and she collapsed into an empty chair by the dance floor, her beautiful, expensive dress pooling around her like a shroud. She was speechless, broken, and utterly humiliated, a queen dethroned in her own kingdom. The perfect wedding was in ruins, destroyed not by a bad DJ, but by a bad person. As the guests began to file out of the ballroom, their hushed whispers creating a funeral-like atmosphere, Ethan descended the stage. He bypassed the weeping figure of his new wife and walked directly to the side of the room where Maya was standing, still holding her phone as if it were a shield. Danielle had paused by the exit, waiting. When Ethan and Maya approached, she gave the young waitress a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you," Danielle said, her voice full of a gratitude that went beyond words. "You were very brave. You didn't have to do that." Maya shook her head, a blush creeping up her neck. "Anyone would have done it," she said, though she knew that wasn't true. Most people had stood by and watched. What she did was wrong. It wasn't right. Ethan looked at Maya, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not just a waitress, but a young woman with a backbone of steel and an unshakable moral compass. She had risked her job to stand up for a stranger. That kind of integrity was rare and valuable. "That was more than just not right," Ethan said, his voice filled with respect. "That was courage, and that's something my company values. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. I'm the CEO of Sanders Tech. I have an opening in my corporate communications department. It's a PR role. It's about managing perception, but more importantly, it's about telling the truth. I think you'd be very good at it. Maya stared at the card, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked from the card to Ethan's serious face, then to Danielle's encouraging smile. A PR job? But I'm a waitress, she stammered. I don't have any experience. You have experience in what matters, Ethan said firmly. You have integrity. We can teach you the rest. Call my assistant on Monday. The job is yours if you want it. Danielle then placed a gentle hand on Maya's arm. And if corporate life isn't for you, she said, her eyes twinkling, I happen to know a little something about the music business. I'm starting a new initiative to mentor young women in the industry. I could use someone with your kind of fire on my team. Maya's world, which an hour ago had consisted of clearing tables and refilling water glasses, had just cracked wide open with possibility. She was looking at two of the most powerful people she had ever met, and they weren't just acknowledging her. They were offering her a future. She had gone from being an invisible server to a potential executive, from a bystander to a boss in training. Her eyes filled with tears, but these were not tears of humiliation or anger. They were tears of shock, of gratitude, and of the overwhelming realization that a single act of courage, a simple choice to speak up when everyone else remained silent, had the power to change a life forever. She had stood up for a stranger's dignity, and in doing so, had unlocked her own. The grand ballroom emptied out quickly, leaving behind a scene of chaos and abandonment. Half-eaten plates of cake, abandoned champagne flutes, and the ghost of a celebration that had died a sudden, violent death. The wedding had ended before it had ever truly begun. In a small office off the main hall, Ethan was on the phone, his voice low and firm. The person on the other end was his lawyer. The words annulment and fraud were being used. The marriage, which had been legally created that afternoon, was being dismantled that evening. Victoria was gone, whisked away by her stunned parents, her fairy tale ending dissolving into a cautionary tale that would be whispered about for years. Danielle drove home through the glittering city streets, the windows of her car down, the cool night air washing over her. The sound of the city was a symphony she understood far better than the strained silence of the wedding reception. She wasn't jubilant. She didn't feel a sense of triumphant victory. She just felt a quiet sense of rightness, of balance restored. She had gone to the wedding with the intention of being humble, of making herself small to let others shine. But the night had taught her a powerful lesson. Humility was a choice, a virtue, but it was not a shield against the cruelty of others. Sometimes humility could be mistaken for weakness, and when that happened, silence was no longer an option. She thought about her power, not the power that came from her wealth or her fame, but the power of her work, the power of her integrity. Victoria had tried to take that from her, to reduce her to a label, a stereotype. But you couldn't take something from a person who knew with absolute certainty who they were. Her strength wasn't in the Grammy on her shelf. It was in the hard work that had earned it. It was in the kindness she had shown a friend in need. It was in the calm she had maintained in the face of a storm. As she pulled into the driveway of her beautiful modern home, a home built not with inherited wealth but with talent, sweat, and perseverance, she allowed herself a small, weary smile. Humility is strength, she reflected, but sometimes strength requires you to stop being humble. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the world see exactly who you are, and let the consequences fall where they may. The narrator closes with the final, resonant moral of the story. Never mistake humility for weakness. The one you mock today may own the stage tomorrow. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.